tank Horizon Group based in Geneva for the exclusive presentation of the COVID Economic Recovery Index. This new index measures for the first time the capacity of more than 120 countries to weather the COVID and estimate the potential of rebound after the crisis. So to present this important study, we have with us today Margaret Jeniek. She is the managing partner at Horizon Group, and she is also the co-author of this study. Then we have, unfortunately, without the video, the video picture, we have Sheena Tamborji. She is also a senior advisor of Horizon Group, and she is also very closely involved in this study as a co-author. And finally, we have James Zhan. Mr. Zhan is the director of the Investment and Enterprise Division at UNCTAD, United Nations Conference on Trade and Development. So let's now go directly to the result of this COVID Economic Recovery Index. And I have the pleasure to give the floor, the digital floor, I will say, to Margaret Jeniek, head of the study at Horizon Group. Margareta, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Pierre, and good morning, everyone. Very excited to launch this today. It was an interesting project for us that allowed us to explore the many interdependencies and a lot of the data that we brought together in order to assess and learn more about which countries are well prepared for recovery after the COVID crisis. I have a few slides that I would like to share, so let me just share my slides and take it from there. So, okay. So why a COVID recovery index, economic recovery index? I think when we started the project, the thinking was really about how can we use data in order to support decisions. Many of the decisions, especially at the beginning, were very ad hoc. We are all flying blind. And we wanted to provide a tool for policymakers and for business leaders that could reduce the uncertainty and increase information and give them a better basis for decision making. This was essentially the initial motivation at the outset. The tool also can help countries identify other countries that are facing similar challenges and identify good practices that they can learn from. And the tool can also help countries support the efforts to identify what needs to be done to strengthen recovery in the long term. So there's a number of advantages to doing this study, and we hope it will be widely used. At the core of the study is an index. An index is essentially a data-based assessment that we do, and we group indicators into categories. And those three categories that we have identified based on our deliberations and our internal proprietary expertise is, first of all, health resilience. So this is how resilient are the countries in terms of health capacity, in terms of exposure to risk factors among the population. So these are the important factors that we look at. The second one is the absorptive capacity of the economy, which is to which degree will the country be affected by the initial shock of the COVID economic crisis. So this means that is the country exposed to vulnerable sectors, for example, that we're looking at. How are the debt levels here as well? Was the initial labor market performance strong? Was there a lot of unemployment, a lot of informal economy at the beginning? Is it reliant on international markets, because then the contagion is likely to be stronger? Social resilience factors as well at the outset, such as income inequality and poverty. And then also aspects around food security, because we know that this has been, in particular for many developing countries, a huge topic. And then the third bucket that we look at is economic resilience. And economic resilience is essentially looking at identifying those factors that will drive the speed of recovery afterwards. So are the labor markets adaptable? Is governance and social capital, are they strong? Market size is also an important factor, because an internal market it's easier for countries with a large and wealthy internal market to rely on this internal market for their growth. digital economy prevalence as well, education and skills, and then of course financial system resilience is an important factor as well. The index essentially is designed to measure the degree to which the countries have in place those factors that will help them weather the crisis and recover over the medium term. Whether to recover to pre-COVID levels or not, we don't know. We know that the economy is going to be different when we recover, but to recover to solid economic, robust economic growth. A few words about the data. So we use about over 100 indicators from a number of international organizations, both quantitative indicators, mainly from intergovernmental organizations such as WHO, International Monetary Fund, and ILO. We also use a few sources of qualitative data where this was necessary to assess qualitative concepts. Wellcome Trust, World Economic Forum, Johns Hopkins Center for Health and Security, and Gallup are some of the main sources that we are using for this qualitative data. So these are, it's important to remember that these are indeed renowned sources that we look at for this, that we have brought together. About 12,000 data points, so it has been a major effort to bring this data together. And let's delve into the results. And here you see, the results on the global map. Immediately visible, we cover 122 countries, first of all, so over 120 countries, so over 95% of the global economy. It's a very significant coverage. It was important for us to take a look in particular at a solid number of developing countries where the data is often less available. So the selection was mainly driven by data availability. But because a lot of those assessments are particularly relevant for emerging markets and developing countries. We see, first of all, on this map already that there's an important north-south divide. So the results are significantly influenced by the level of development of countries, or to some extent influenced. We see that European countries, North America and Australia and Japan are performing rather well, whereas many of the developing countries, from a regional perspective, many countries in Africa are performing less well. Latin America is somewhere in between, and Asia is a very mixed picture. So there are significant differences within regions as well, even within the European region when you compare countries such as Germany with further east, the Ukraine or the Balkan countries. Let's take a look at the results of the selected countries, and unveiling a ranking is always interesting. The top 4 countries are Nordic economies, or European northern European economies. Finland tops the ranking, followed by Norway, followed by Germany and Switzerland. In terms of, for Finland, what was important is that it is a very skilled and digitalized workforce, very digitalized economy. The country has strong governance and strong social capital. This applies to both Finland and Norway. And then, further down the road, Germany is a country that has also highly digitalized, somewhat less affected by the initial shock than many other countries in the neighborhood. Is at a large country market size as well. And then when we look at a little bit further down in the rankings, the United States at 7th, which seems a fairly good position. And I think it's both good news for the United States. It's a country that is facing many challenges right now in terms of health and economic terms. However, what we see in the results is that the United States has a very solid capacity to rebound afterwards. We see that it's very strongly affected by the initial shock, but it also has a very strong capacity to rebound, mainly because it's a very digital and innovative economy, a very adaptable workforce, solid skills, and a lot has been done in recent years to stabilize the financial system, which is paying off now as well. Further down the ranking, we see China at 32nd. China is actually to a lesser extent affected by the initial shock. It has a very resilient industry structure, resilient to the COVID shock. It is somewhat less connected international, which it's a very large market internal market that it can rely on, which is a particular advantage right now. And it's a country also that, in terms of recovery, the recovery capacity or the resilience to rebound is somewhat lower than a number of other countries, but it's still very solid, and it still has a number of advantages, such as decent shape financial system, solid skill set overall in comparison to others. So a lot of the progress that China has been doing in the past years on the fundamentals that drive growth is paying off. Russian Federation, it is fairly good 36th position here, mainly driven by low debt levels, an adaptable and skilled workforce as well, which has a very good level of education. However, we see also that there are challenges in governance and also in with respect to the capacity of the health system. Brazil, a little bit further down in the ranking, benefits from a large market size. It's a fairly digitalized, very sophisticated economy. However, has challenges because of low social resilience and high income inequalities. And then further down in the ranking at 77th among the BRICS, South Africa, which has the advantage of having fairly low debt levels, and for the region, a fairly solid financial system, but has very strong income inequalities, which it suffers from right now. In the current context. And India, slightly above South Africa at 63rd, which is less affected in terms of its industry structure by the COVID shock, but of course very affected economically and also from a humanitarian perspective, and has some challenges mainly due to the workforce skills that are not sufficient to provide for strong capacity to rebound. One comparison that is particularly interesting, of course, and that we're keen to show is the comparison between the United States and China, and it's all on the scale of 0 to 100. So we cut it down a little bit, but you can see here the interesting difference that both countries are to similar extent affected by the initial shock. So this is what's measured by the absorptive capacity. The economies are vulnerable to similar extents. China a little bit stronger than the United States. This is mainly because the United States has a much stronger, some of the sectors that are much affected by COVID are much bigger in the United States. Tourism, retail in particular, entertainment as well. Some of the parts of the entertainment sector are affected very strongly by the COVID pandemic. So the sectors take a much stronger share of the economy in the United States than they do in China. However, when we then look at economic resilience and health resilience measures, that's where the United States outperforms China and benefits from so many factors that were built over the longer time, such as this very digital economy, fairly adaptive labor markets, as I said earlier, strong financial system that has been reformed and strengthened in the recent years as well. So all those factors help this economic resilience and will help it over the medium term. And then, on the health resilience side, it really looks at pandemic preparedness, which is fairly strong in the United States because despite the current challenges, it has very strong systems in place and institutions in place to be ready for pandemics and for health management, for public health management. So this is an important factor here. And it also has a very strong capacity in the health system. Very expensive, but very strong capacity in the health system. With this, I'll hand over to Shauna for the next few slides to delve us, just walk us through some of the more detailed findings and also the findings for Switzerland.
Thank you, Margareta, and good morning, everyone. So having looked at the big picture, I've been looking at China and the US, which is always an interesting story. Closer to home, Switzerland, as we saw, ranks 4th overall in terms of its performance on this index. One of the big reasons, of course, that Switzerland is there is it has established over many, many decades a solid system where it performs well in terms of health and economic resilience. In particular, a highly skilled labor market, which is relatively flexible. And we started out with quite low levels, very low levels of unemployment here, which helped. It also clearly has excellent governance and social capital. The systems in place around its digital economy are strong. And all of these have helped on Switzerland's economic resilience. So as we've said, this is not measuring exactly how bad the situation is at the moment, but looking really to the capacity of countries to recover relatively quickly and relatively well. Switzerland's main trading partners, and here on the bar above, where you see going from green to blue to yellow, the green extent of that bar, which is 60%, represents the strength of Switzerland's main export markets, Germany, the US and France, which also perform well in the sense that we anticipate that they will recover faster relative to other economies. This is an advantage for Switzerland. Most of its trade goes to strong markets who over the next few years we should see getting back to something approaching normal levels of activity, which gives Switzerland a big advantage. When you look at it overall, Switzerland's capacity in terms of to absorb the shock was perhaps slightly less than some countries, but still relatively well, and certainly within the near to the regional average. But clearly it outperforms in terms of health and economic resilience. And on the health factors, in particular, while we may always be talking about how much our health insurance costs might rise over the next 12 months, grosso modo, the system here works well, and we've seen the results where cases were high, but levels of deaths were lower than in other countries with similar case levels. And this is in part due to a very strong system, in part due to some of the underlying factors in the population, which means that they are perhaps predisposed to being in slightly better health than some of our peers in the rest of Europe and certain other countries. Next slide, please. If we take a wider look, going back out, zooming back out to looking at the world picture, we really saw at the beginning in the map, there were stark differences in the way that COVID has impacted countries. Many countries are still only discovering the sort of first wave. We're not even sure how many waves are yet to come, or how high or low the situation will go. But what we notice overall, that whatever the region, if we look at Southeast Asia, it is in general the better performing countries who have higher levels of income, perhaps linked to better governance, better skills, and more stability, more relatively stability in their financial markets, who perform well. So whether it's from Southeast Asia or in Latin America, you can see that they are definitely an advantage, those higher income countries in those areas. The regional picture is clearly very different when you look towards Europe and Central Asia, where clearly we have a far greater number of high income, advanced, developed economies. So we would expect to see better performance there. But really, when you look at it, the key for both, the keys in recovery capacity, more perhaps than in some cases just pure wealth, it really is, when we look at the indicators, down to things like good governance, the flexibility and strength of the labour market, and the levels of education and skills among populations, and that relatively stable financial market picture. Those factors are really primordial in the recovery capacity. And on the absorption side, what we haven't talked about a lot thus far is our vulnerable industries. We've all seen here close to home the immediate impact on things like arts, cinema, travel and tourism. But other factors that are contributing to absorptive capacity include social security systems, food security, really fundamental elements that give your population a certain level of capacity to absorb the shock, to get through it. And these two areas, particularly around social security and vulnerable industries, are critical for many, many countries. And if we go to the next slide, perhaps we can take a look actually at another factor whereby we see that while economic resilience goes hand in hand with wealth, and it's a factor that counts, the capacity to absorb the COVID shock is not as correlated with pure wealth and GDP levels. This is perhaps a little bit hard to see on a laptop screen, But you can see over in the top right-hand quadrant where you have countries with high resilience, high absorptive capacity. You see the USA, Japan. You also see China, despite, as Margareta pointed out, it has some weaknesses, but it does perform well. You look to Austria, Slovakia, there's a good mix of countries there. Interestingly, what you see is that countries sometimes, clearly lower income countries are going to recover more slowly, but they have all absorbed shocks in different ways. So it's not a clear-cut picture as to a split where you have all the low-income countries in one quadrant and all the high-income countries in another. There are a variety of factors here which will play out over the next few years, and we'll see how countries recover and rebuild when you look to their fundamentals. Next slide, perhaps. Another aspect which is very marked and threw some surprises up from the results is that countries who perform well on the index are countries in general with lower levels of income inequality. So therefore, Finland, the top performers, when you look at the income inequality levels within those societies, they are much narrower than in others. What we do see, however, is among the best performers, one or two exceptions stand out. Certainly the US, in terms of its overall position as an economic power and its performance in the index, shows markedly higher income inequality levels than in many of its nearest peers. Brazil also is in a country where, though it looks relatively strong given its wider economic performance, it is relatively strong on the economic index, on the recovery index, but it shows, again, quite high levels of income inequality, which could prove, with these added problems around the pandemic, to be a problem for it as it tries to build social capital and trust going forward. Next slide. Going back to that factor of vulnerable industries, which I mentioned, this is a slide which we have drawn on data from the International Labour Organization, whereby they looked at the employment sectors at most risk across a selection of economies. We've taken just a shortcut of the full list here. It's not the full list, but if you look, there's some big names and perhaps unexpected names in this list, not least Singapore, the US, Italy, the UK, and Switzerland. And this is what they have looked at, is the exposure in terms of the number of sectors in an economy that have been seen to be very vulnerable to the sort of shock that COVID brought. Up to 40% of jobs in those vulnerable sectors are at risk, according to the ILO data. The sectors include accommodation, hotel, travel and tourism, retail, wholesale, transport, real estate, and clearly the arts, recreation, entertainment. So these are sectors that in high-performing economies you often find are quite strong, and certainly in terms of the numbers of jobs, even in a diversified economy like Switzerland, these jobs we've seen people being hit. What's made the difference are the social safety nets that governments have introduced and reacted to ensure that people were not made redundant overnight. Those social security nets will obviously have to be somehow adjusted, rolled back a little bit over time. And I suppose, as someone once said, when that tide goes out, when there's less of the immediate government responses there to protect and furlough jobs, we will see what happens then to the employment markets. But when we look at this list, it's clearly quite concerning to see so many high-income countries involved, and countries who overall would have a high level of resilience. So this is clearly a sector and something to watch over the coming months and longer. So thank you. I think, thank you very much for your attention. I think we will now hand over to James.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Sheena. So I will now give the floor to James Zhan. Mr. Zhan, you're the director of the Investment and Enterprise Division of UNCTAD. So you will give us a kind of outside view of this study that you looked at it for sure. And we are very interested to have your point on this. I give you the floor, Mr. Zhan.
Thank you, Pierre, and thanks for Margarita and Sheena inviting me to join this important launching. First of all, I wish to congratulate to Margarita and to Sheena and Horizon for this excellent report and index. It's commendable, it's timely in terms of efforts, in terms of outcomes. And I do see that it's timely for providing the insights at the time of what we call VUCA, this volatility, ambiguity, uncertainty, and complexity. With this current situation, it is a big challenge for the firms and the states and international organizations to look ahead. And it's very important to have this instrument. I see it not only in terms of competitiveness, which countries are doing better than the others, more resilient, more strong in fundamentals. That is important. That's important for business. But I also see that it's important also to look at those countries who are at the bottom of the list, which means they need international support. Governments need the efforts. International organizations need to intensify their efforts to help them because they are vulnerable. Not necessarily they are the lowest income countries in the world, but also other countries, as we know at the moment, as an international forum of discussions, including yesterday, I participated in the ministerial, finance ministerial conference yesterday, talking about how to support, how to mobilize resources to help the vulnerable economies. Vulnerable includes middle and higher middle income countries who are vulnerable, but they are not in the ranking of the Euro targets of international support like IMF, World Bank, and the United Nations. And these countries, including in the Caribbean region, they are vulnerable because of various reasons. So they need support at this time. So I see this index also gives kind of instrument in a scientific manner using so many indicators, hard and soft indicators, a combination of the available data points to pinpoint the countries where they need support. That is a development perspective I wish to bring in addition to the usefulness of this this index for business and looking for the best locations for investment, particularly looking through with this instrument to look through the envisaged, the possible investment scenarios based on all these indicators for the countries where they see, and particularly as Margarita and Sheena pointed out, some emerging markets also, which are in the difficulties like the advanced countries, but to see where investment can go. So that's the firm level. We take it for granted. At country level, that countries need to see where their blind spots are, where their weaknesses are, and where the strong points that countries need to learn from each other. Because after all, if you look at the three sets of indicators, the indicators for recovery is more of longer term. It's the fundamentals. So in the middle of the crisis, we not only need to look at the resilience of the healthy resilience, the absorptive capacity, but also the fundamentals for the longer term development, which is a key, and it's important to remind governments of that perspective. So overall, I think this is a kind of robust approach. I see it with my limited knowledge, the best in the market of this kind, I would say. And it's commendable because it's data-driven analysis. Of course, some of the data, opinion data, soft data indicators compare with others are hard indicators, and that may raise some questions by some countries or some firms or some individuals. But that's normal. That's it's different perspective that may impact on the ranking. But overall, I think it is very useful too, and I really commend that the journalists to report on it, to look at it carefully. Thank you.
Thank you very much, James, for this view. And perhaps, if you allow me, I just would like to ask a few questions, because there are one or two points that are striking me. First, Southern countries were very affected because of also their informal economy. So it stopped almost all at a sudden. Is this not also a good reason that they would be able to relaunch very quickly this economy, as they just can start again without having all an infrastructure to put back in place? What's your point on this? Perhaps Margareta, can you tell me something about that?
Yeah, thank you, Pierre. So we do have the indicator of employment in the informal economy in the index. So we did take into account the degree of the informal economy and the ability to absorb the initial shock. I think the informal economy is for those countries that are affected and that have a high share of informal economy, it's a very serious challenge, just because all those, first of all, from the social perspective, because people will not have access to any type of support. And informal economy exists everywhere. It's not just an issue of developing countries. It's the informal economy is quite pervasive. So this is an important element. I think the social element is important to keep in mind, and the access to social security systems, which are very important in terms of cushioning the most dire poverty resulting out of this COVID pandemic, but also in terms of provided income support and stabilizing demand simply as well, right? So it is very important it's much more difficult for those countries to cushion the blow through their social security systems if there is a high share of the informal economy. From a recovery perspective, I don't see it as a particular advantage. I think you cannot always say it's not necessarily a more flexible approach. The informal economy in most of the countries, it may allow people in some cases to survive, but I would, I think in this particular situation it was a disadvantage rather than advantage. There's this argument that informal economy is the Greece in situations where the administrative barriers are very strong. It allows people to still go about their business, right? There's this argument that's been put forward a few years ago. I would see in the recovery process, it is more a disadvantage and a challenge, just because countries with a strong informal economy, it's much more difficult for people to find jobs, to find employment. All the informal networks that were destroyed over the employment relationships that people had that were informal were destroyed very often, or were cut down. So reconstructing this is very difficult for people. So it will slow down the recovery process rather than speed it up.
Okay. I have a question about the duration of the crisis. As James said, we are actually in the middle of the crisis. We don't know exactly at what stage, but we are full in it. What will be the impact of the duration of this crisis on this gap between North and South? The duration means absolutely that the gap will widen and widen, or how can you analyze that? I don't know who wants to answer on this. Perhaps Sheena? Can you hear me? Yeah.
Thank you. Well, that is a risk. I think as James said, I mean, firstly, it's very important, as he talked about the fact that the developing countries, in many cases, just do not have the access to the reserves, and the systems aren't in place to both sort of intervene and bring cash to people who need it to subsist, just not to thrive and recover, but just to subsist in many cases. And so therefore, I think that a longer duration in countries where there's a low level of possibility to transfer into digital work, which is what has saved many jobs here in Europe, is the switch from commuting physically to an office to be able to work from home. In countries where many of the sectors are very high in terms of manual work and semi-skilled work, that sort of option isn't there. So anything that stops people physically working for a long time is going to be a big driver of problems for those countries. But I don't think we should forget that the inequalities picture, it's all relative. Within countries as well, you have inequalities. And here as well, even among more developed and advanced economies, again, unfortunately, many lower income jobs tend to be those that you cannot do remotely. And in some cases, they're very critical jobs. We've seen over the course of the peak of the crisis how critical healthcare workers are. And yet, many of them are in the lower brackets of incomes in many advanced economies. And therefore, I think that the inequality question is something that this crisis, the longer it lasts, the more likely this is to rise up the agenda politically and socially, that it will need to be addressed. In the middle of a crisis is never an ideal to have a moment to try and address it, but this crisis needs to trigger some very hard thinking about how you go about as jobs over the next decades will transition to being more digital and needing more skills, so the fewer manual and fewer semi-skilled roles. You need to prepare populations long-term for that, and in the immediate term, you need to protect the most vulnerable populations internationally through international help, and within countries through deliberate policy interventions by the state.
If I just may add on to that, I think there's one element that we see in the data which is quite interesting, and this is that actually the absorptive capacity, there is no difference depending on level of development, right? It's not correlated with the level of development, the absorptive capacity. So countries are affected by the crisis independently of the level of development. They can be affected a lot or less. But however, the ability to recover afterwards, so the speed of the recovery, is very strongly related to the income level. This is really interesting because it means that developing countries may recover just much more slowly. So, the convergence over the past years, developing countries have been converging with levels of development, with levels of income, right? They've been catching up. So this catch up may be either slower, or in the worst case scenario, it could even end this convergence, this COVID economic recovery crisis, just because the recovery is going to be much slower in developing countries. This is what the data shows. So they do less well on the economic resilience generally. So this is not good news. And as James pointed out, a very important lesson for development assistance.
You mentioned as recommendations for the governments to try to handle at the best level this crisis. You mentioned some changes that are very deep changes. I mean, you're talking about changing governance. You're asking for flexibility in employment. These are very, very slow-moving changes. So, what do you think about this, Mr. Zhan? How will the countries that are the most vulnerable really have a chance to catch up and accelerate their management of this crisis, the good management of the crisis?
Yeah, it's a very challenging question, Pierre. The first, your earlier question about recovery, I think if we talk about global economic recovery, the current consensus is that it could be towards the next year, middle of next year, or towards the end of next year, the economic recovery. That's possibly a kind of a V-shaped recovery. But if we look at different aspects of the global economy, for instance, in trade, in terms of trade and GDP, of course, it's true, it's possibly to be a V-shaped recovery starting middle of next year. But if you talk about global investment, FDI, for example, the recovery will not happen until 2022, and that will be a slow recovery. It's a kind of a U-shaped recovery that we forecasted. And the next year, and this year, global FDI will decline by up to 40%. And next year will be another decline, a further decline of 5 to 10%. And when we look at the recovery in 2022, it'll be driven by cooperative restructuring, value chain restructuring, by the replenishment of the capital stock, and driven by, of course, economic recovery. Recovery will lead to the FDI recovery. There's a time lag. So that's in terms of different aspects. In terms of industries, some industries will lag further behind. Let's see, for example, the airlines. What I learned, it is according to the airline industries, that it won't recover till the January, to the level of January of this year until 2024. So that's a kind of 4-year time horizon. So industries also varies. Countries also, I think the Horizons Index has indicated those who are on top of the list may recover earlier than the others. For the time being, we know, and that was said yesterday by the IMF head at the finance ministers meeting, that for the time being, it's only China has been on the recovery road, and others will still be ahead. So that's about the economic recovery. For the lowest, for all countries, in fact, and particularly for developing countries, crisis is a window of opportunity for reforms, for improvement. All these indicators in this horizons show that if countries are below the kind of midpoint, they need to take this as an opportunity to really work hard. And they need to work hard with international organizations. For the time being, the OECD countries, the DAC group, committed not to reduce the level of ODA at the time of the crisis. And we envisage for the time being, it's kind of 8% of decline of ODA. It's not that much, but we want to protect this level. But more importantly, the DAC group committed to improve the quality of the ODAs, targeting better. Now, this instrument that Margarita and Sheila and the team developed is a tool for ODA and for international organizations, better target at all those countries, not only the countries, but also the aspect in those countries which are vulnerable, which need to be addressed. So I hope this narrow, timely, in terms of time, is a narrow window of opportunity, could be taken by international organizations, donors, and those countries that to improve their economic environment and business environment.
Thank you, James. Margareta or Sheila, you want to add something about that? Okay. You're not on the microphone. Okay, one more question. We say in France, in French, we would say there is an effet pervers, perverse effect of some measures that have been taken. Let's talk about what's going on in the United States, in Brazil, where we have two presidents that are not pushing for strong measures, and they are very keen to restart on a very regular basis the economy of their countries. The fact that they don't really consider as a full priority the fight against COVID-19 and are privileging the economy, isn't that a factor, a very important factor that will determine that they will restart their country faster than the other ones and the economy will restart quicker, but without perhaps the security for the people on a health level. It's a bit a political question, but I don't know how if you addressed this question in your study, Margareta.
So we did not directly address this question in the study. We actually looked at it from our perspective. It needs to go hand in hand. You know, you cannot do either or, right? It's first of all, it's so interlinked. The effects on the economy do not only come from lockdowns, they come from international interconnections, first of all, right? So the global economy goes down, the countries that are exporting a lot will lose some of their demand, some of their exports. So this is one reason. And the other reason, this is a psychological factor, is that if people are concerned and afraid, they will not go shopping into the shops if there is a virus going around. So I think what's very important in this context, and this is something that we have also measured, is to have what we call social capital, and the fact that people care for each other and they care for community, for the communities, that they care for, that they have strong networks and linkages, that they trust the government and they trust overall the society. These are very important factors. So I don't think there is to come back to your question, I don't think there is a way there's no shortcuts to this, right? If you privilege the economy now and open it up completely, you may have the effects on health and security within a short period of time. And it may not come from the government through a lockdown. It may come because people are afraid. So it's a balance. It's a balance about reassuring. We know that most of the countries, for all the countries, it's a new situation. So they need to they're acting among a lot of uncertainty. With this study, we actually aim to reduce some of the uncertainty, bring back the situation to the fundamentals as well, and highlight the fundamentals, which are important also in this current context. But it's all about a balancing act, and about learning from other experience, from other countries' experiences. Maybe not a lockdown will not be necessary, but we need to do more contact tracing. So it's not a trade-off in the way it's sometimes presented, I think.
Okay. Is there anything else you would like to add on this study that seems important to you, especially on this part of what's the good way to recover? What can be done best to recover today for a country? What's number one measure? I know it's a simple question, but it's probably a question that many governments are asking themselves. And I would add to this one, the big threat by many governments seems to be a new confinement, meaning a new lockdown. Is this really the biggest threat for the economy, a new lockdown? Everybody wants to avoid that. Who would like to answer?
I think maybe let me take that one on the factors that countries need to do. There's no silver bullet, right? There's not one thing that they need to do, and there's not. Unfortunately, it's a very complex situation, and the political measures are very complex. I think what is important that countries look at is how can the current there's a lot of stimulus programs going on. There's a lot of recovery programs that are being put into place. So for me, the question is, how can those be used to strengthen resilience over the medium to longer term? Because the shocks are not going to decrease; they're going to increase. Shocks being from a pandemic or being from other types of risks, and countries need to be strengthen their resilience. There are a few ways of doing this. One way is, for example, Singapore has been giving people who are unemployed or who are on furlough schemes training to develop their future skills, digital skills, to be more employable in the future workforce, because we know that the workforce will be changing and the workplace will be changing quite significantly. The automation has been accelerated, digitization has been accelerated. So this is one possibility. Another possibility is to target infrastructure investment to access, and this is more for developing countries, to ensure that digital networks are accessed from everywhere. Some of it is just about ticking two boxes at the same time, the short term and the longer term, that is that makes resilience one of the priorities for countries. So this is one thing. I think on the lockdown, I think that goes back to what I said earlier. Many countries have been experimenting with how to deal with the crisis. It's not necessarily the countries that have experienced a lockdown may be afraid of the lockdown, but when you look at the research that has come out recently, it's not necessarily just the lockdown. There are many other factors that actually lead to a crisis. It's not just the lockdown, right? So the psychological factors, the fear, the trust in the government, the trust within the society are important factors. The other factors are, the external factors, how connected the country is with others, what are the demands, effects from the global economy as well. So it's not just about the lockdown, but it is about, a cost-benefit analysis. I do strongly believe that, to look at, and we may have even some information, some experience, and some data to explore, how can we protect most efficiently as well the populations without potentially harming the economy too much, right? So it's all about the balance. And Korea has been doing a lot of experiments with contact tracing. It has been very successful with contact tracing as well, which is a different way than a lockdown. So it's, I think, generally more reflection and more of a cost-benefit view on those measures would be recommended.
Thank you. If there is no question in the audience, I perhaps would like to just to conclude is one more question, not directly related to the study, but what in your view, and I would like to ask that Mr. Zhan, what in your view would be the impact of a vaccine coming out at the beginning, let's say at the beginning of next year? Would it really on an economic point of view, have a very strong effect for a rebound of these economies, or actually not even? So I don't know. What will be the impact of that?
It's a very good question. I think first, symbolically, it boosts the confidence in people, confidence in business, confidence in economy, and overall. That symbolically is very important for confidence enhancing. But secondly, the preparedness for having this vaccines, preparedness in several dimensions. The first dimension is that people are ready to take on that. For the time being, there is a large proportion of the population will be hesitating in taking it. So that's from the individual's perspective. The other perspective is that quite a number of advanced countries have already prepared that once the vaccine is out, they will have a massive production and for delivery. The key issue is that how the vaccine can reach to the vulnerable people in developing countries, in low-income countries, timely, effectively. That part is missing. So from the laboratory to the factory, from the farmers to the ground of poor population, vulnerable in developing countries, for them to get, this is a big challenge. And it is not, I haven't seen the effective measures yet. And that is critically important because in this pandemic, if one is left behind, it means everybody will be impacted on. So for that, it's a big challenge. The vaccine, for the time being, with the international funds, the main efforts is on R&D and on the coordination of production, massive production, but then how to deliver to the large population. All those colored in the index in red, they need it, be it the poorest or even middle income, higher income, vulnerable economies. Therefore, the key word is international cooperation in the interdependent world. We're still interdependent. Thanks.
Thank you very much for these final words. Yeah, the perspectives seem not too good. If I understand, vaccine even would be one more element to widen the gap between North and South, which for sure is not very encouraging. So thank you very much for this presentation. Margareta, Sheena, do you want to add something to have a conclusion word about that? No? Okay, then thank you very much. Very interesting discussion. You will find that all the documents, the full report, the presentation, you will find it on the website of the Horizon Group and also on the website of the Geneva Press Club, Club Suisse de la Presse. It was a pleasure to have this discussion with you, and I wish you all the best. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Pierre. And
Thank you, Pierre.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Jana.